Good evening. Today is March 7th, 2021, and our lesson is Lesson 1, and it is entitled Difficult Passages in Genesis and Exodus. Some scripture passages are confusing and troubling to Christians of the 21st century, in that they may lose some of their mystique when considered in the light of history and culture in the time they portray, such as in the case with the events in today's lesson. We're going to be looking at a few scriptures out of Genesis and Exodus, those being Genesis chapter 15, verses 1 through 21, also Exodus 4, verses 18 through 26, and chapter 33, 11 through 23. I'm just going to read these, and then these are fairly short, so I don't think they'll take a lot of time for me to read them, and then we'll go into them a little bit. Genesis 15, verse 12. And when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and lo, an horror and a great darkness fell upon him. And he said unto Abram, Know of a surety that thy seed shall be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and they shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also the nation whom they shall serve I will judge, and afterwards they shall come out with great substance. And thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace, thou shalt be buried in a good old age. And in verse 16, but in the fourth generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. So, the scripture that we're looking at here is, in particular, is the scripture saying that a deep sleep fell on Abram. Well, we know the story of Abram in chapter 12 of Genesis. He was called out. He was called out from his father's house, and God told him to go to a land that I will show thee. And most of us know the story of Abram. He came out of the land of Chaldees, and he went down into Canaan. There was a famine in Canaan, so he went to Egypt. Now, I'd like to point out a couple things. Abram was human and had his frailties just as we have. He had his weaknesses. God had called him out of his father's house, and yet we read a little while there that he took his father and Lot with him, which he was not instructed to do. So I believe that was the first failure of Abram. And then we see Abram going down into Egypt because of the famine. But God had told him that he was his shield and his reward. And like us, many times we don't have the trust that we should have. And so in his own thing, he went down to Egypt to seek for food. Well, then we find while he was in Egypt, there we run into another problem. He saw that Pharaoh liked his wife, and so he lied and told him that his wife was his sister. Well, we know that in his lineage, in that day, she was his sister, but I don't think that that's what he had in mind when he told him that he was his sister. So if we read those things, we see that every time Abram went down, he got into trouble, and when he went up and looked up, is when his troubles ended. So God had made covenant. God had told him several times that that he was going to take care of him, that he would be a great nation, that he would have a son, and that son would be the beginning of a great nation. So, and we know that many times Abram lost sight of that and did things that were not what God had wanted him to do. So at this point, God said that he would make a covenant. And I don't know if you're familiar with covenants, but God told him to bring 3-year-old animals. He told him a heifer, a she-goat, a he-goat, a pair of turtle doves, and a pair of pigeons. And as was the custom in that day, he divided those animals, he slew those animals, and he divided them in two, and they were laid apart from one another. And as was the custom of those days, when there would be a covenant made, it was always made, not always, but I'll say usually made a lesser and a greater. Let's say a king and a vassal would. So they would make a covenant. Well, they would walk through the twain of those two bodies, and they would be as one. Also, in those days, they would exchange weapons, and they would shake hands. And it was always, they would shake the right hand, because most men were right-handed, and if you're shaking hands with somebody, then you can't draw your weapon. And so I thought that was an interesting little tidbit. So we really see this where God made this covenant that Abram waited, we don't know how long, but we know it was long enough for the vultures to gather and try to feed on those carcasses that he had laid apart there. And we're told later on that it became dark and that a deep sleep fell on Abram. And that's when we read that God came in. And God came, he passed through those animals himself. Abram did not pass through. We read that there was a flaming torch and a smoking furnace. And I've read several different commentaries on this, and there's a lot of opinions on what those things symbolized. The thing that came to me is we read that God is a consuming fire, and I believe that we're not told in this scripture, but I believe that those animals were consumed as God's fire went past through them. So we want to skip down to let's see. Let's skip down to, well, there's one other point I wanted to make. We read this, but if we look over in the book of Hebrews in chapter 6, in verses 13 through 18, I won't read those. You can read those, and you probably know those yourself. But we're told there that the lesser is blessed to the greater, and because God is the greater, and there was no one his equal that could swear with him, he swore to himself. And the covenant that he made because Abram had no part in that covenant. God supplied all of Abram's needs. He made the promises the things that he would do for Abram, and he fulfilled those things in himself, that Abram had no part in those, because Abram had only one thing that God required him to supply, and that was believing in that God would do as he said he would do. And we read that because Abram believed, that was counted to him as righteousness. Now, we want to skip down and look at Exodus chapter 4, verse 19. And the Lord said unto Moses in Midian, Go, return into Egypt, for all the men are dead which sought thy life. And of course we know that story, that in the beginning that Moses saw an Egyptian smiting or beating a Jew slave, and Moses fought with the Egyptian and killed him. And fearing he would be found out, he fled to Midian. And so, and following verse 24, and it came to pass by the way, excuse me, and it came to pass by the way in the end that the Lord met him and sought to kill him. And Zipporah took a sharp stone and cut off the foreskin of her son and cast it at his feet, and said, Surely a bloody husband thou art thou to me. So he let him go, and she said, A bloody husband thou art, and because of the circumcision. And in verse, well, let's stop right there. So, and that might be hard to understand, that scripture, but we have to remember that circumcision was a bloody ritual that they had to do on the seventh day. God had commanded back in Exodus 17 that all male children were to be circumcised on the seventh day. And it appears that in this scripture that this child, which was probably their first child named Goshen, was not circumcised. I don't know that if Moses had put this off, or maybe his wife Zipporah was not used to the ritual, and so, but at any rate, it was put off. And because of that, Moses had broke God's covenant. And so we read that God came to kill him. Now the Septuagint, which is the Old Testament written in Greek, tells us that it was the angel of the Lord. So it could be either of those two. Either way, God was angry with Moses, and he had come to kill him. But when Zipporah did the circumcision herself, God's wrath was satisfied, and he turned away from that. So those are just two of the difficult scriptures that we've looked at. And so we want to go down to chapter 33 of Exodus and verse 18. And he said, I beseech thee, show me thy glory. And this is Moses speaking. And he said, I will make all my goodness pass before thee, and I will proclaim thy name of the Lord before thee, and I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show mercy to whom I will show mercy. Verse 20, and he said, Thou canst not see my face, for there shall no man see me and live. And the Lord said, Behold, there is a place by me, and thou shalt stand upon a rock. And it shall come to pass, when my glory passes by, that I will put thee in a cleft of the rock, and I will cover thee with my hand while I pass by. And verse 23, and I will make mine hand, and thou shalt see my back parts, but my face thou shalt not see. So we're in this scripture, we're seeing that Moses has asked God to see his face. And God tells Moses that you can't see my face because you will die. And we're told also in the New Testament, in the book of John, Jesus speaks of that no man has seen God at any time. So, but what God does is before he passes, he puts Moses in the cleft of a rock, and as he passes by, he holds his hand so that he cannot see his face, but he can see his glory of his hinder parts. And also, God said, I'll make you to see my goodness. So I believe that he gave Moses the knowledge of God's goodness at that point. So let's see. Well, this has been a short lesson. I think it's an interesting lesson. And next week, we're going to have a little more of the same. We're going to move along some more. But I hope you have enjoyed it. I hope you've got some understanding out of it. I know that there's a lot of you that know these things already, but for those who don't know them or don't understand them, I hope that this has given you a little light. God's scripture is true, and we really can't read the Old Testament without reading the New Testament with it. We read the Old Testament, we read the Psalms. A lot of the Psalms give us explanation to the Old Testament. A lot of the New Testament gives explanation to Psalms. So it's all stitched together. It's God's story for man, of how he chose man from the beginning, chose the Jewish people as his people, and that how he gave them a special place in the world, and how they failed to keep his law. And in doing that, he proved to man, to us, that keeping the law is impossible, and that only through the sacrifice of his Son, Jesus Christ, can we be saved, because no man can keep the law, and it's only through faith that we can be saved. So with that, I say God bless you and keep you, and we'll look forward to seeing you next weekend.